Chef Boyardee, Pringles potato chips, Sara Lee. How about even things like Frisbees or Guppies? Where did all those names come from? Well, the author of the book, The Names Familiar, is with us, and she's going to be sharing with us some of the secrets of how names came to be. Laura Lee is our first guest. She's traveling the United States doing book signings for her book, The Names Familiar. And Laura, welcome to WHO Radio.
Good morning.
This is really a fascinating book. I'm amazed sometimes where people get ideas for books, and this, now that I've read it, seems like an obvious idea. There are so many hundreds and thousands of products out there, and where the names come from, we don't seem to know. So where did you come up with the idea for this book?
Well, it started when I was doing a morning show on the radio and looking for things to talk about. So I had a lot of trivia type of books and history type of books, and I was always collecting things. And I came across the story of Alice Liddell, who was the little girl who inspired Alice in Wonderland. And I was very interested to know that this fictional character was a real person. And I thought there must have been a lot of other people like that. So that became one category of trivia I was collecting to use on my morning show, is familiar names.
So you just started collecting different articles.
Right, articles and magazines and marking things. And you can never have a book after I've gone through it because I mark things.
So your file just kept getting bigger and bigger, and eventually it turned into a book.
Right, I had a certain amount of them, and I didn't think, people ask a lot how long it took me to write it, and it's hard to say because I didn't start out thinking that I was writing a book, so
right.
I just collected it over time.
What are some of the products that you get asked the most about?
Actually, the one I get asked the most about is one that's not in the book, is Aunt Jemima. And the reason that she's not in the book is I wasn't able to trace that back to a real person. It was an old minstrel song, Aunt Jemima, and if there was a real person behind it, that's too far back. I wasn't able to find it.
I know a couple of times in the book you're unsure exactly where the origin is. There may be 2 or 3 different versions of how a name came to be.
Right, and I just tried to come up with the most feasible or present the different versions that I came across.
Mm-hmm. How difficult is it to find the origins? How much work does it take? What were some of the tough ones?
Well, it depends. Sometimes it takes a long time to track down. It takes as long to track down that a word didn't come from a person's name as that it came from a person's name. For example, Pringles potato chips. I spent some time trying to figure out who Pringles potato chips were named for, and it turns out that they were named for being on Pringle Street in Chicago.
That's amazing.
And there was no Mr. Pringle at all.
We all think there is because there's a guy's picture on the can.
Right, there's a man on the can, so you figure that's supposed to be Mr. Pringle.
Were there other names that ended up not being real people, but named after something else?
Dennys restaurant chain, I really wanted to find out who Denny was, and it turns out it used to be Danny's. It started out as Danny's Donuts and evolved into the restaurant. They changed it to Denny's. So then I started trying to figure out who Danny was, and I finally got my answer when the man who started the restaurant chain died this past year, and in his obituary it said that he just made up the name Danny because it sounded friendly.
Isn't that interesting? The book is called The Names Familiar, and we're going to give away some copies today. In just a couple of minutes, we'll be opening up the phone lines, and we're going to give you a name quiz. I've got some multiple choice and true-false questions to see if you can guess where some of the names came from. But, Laura, you've put the names in some different categories. At least in the very beginning of the book, you talk about categories. For example, the obvious names. For instance, Washington, anything Washington was probably named after George Washington. So sometimes the names are obvious, but sometimes there's a story. For instance, Duncan Hines. You know, we may think he had something to do with cake mixes or something like that, but really he didn't. But there was a real Duncan Hines.
Yes, he was a food critic, so he was known for talking about the quality of foods. And when they decided to come out with a cake mix, they wanted to have basically his endorsement. So they got permission to use his name, but he didn't have anything to do with making the cake mix at all.
So were there real people like Russell Stover? When we see Russell Stover candy, and we assume there was a person named Russell Stover, is that real?
Yes, he was. He started out selling ice cream, actually, ice cream bars, and eventually was selling these sort of things door to door, and made enough money to sell candy and so on. He developed the first Eskimo Pie. And,
oh, really?
And people around the country thought, hey, this is a good idea, so they just started selling their own Eskimo pies. And Stover and his partner, he had a partner named Christian Nelson. They spent so much time in court trying to defend the rights to the patent for their Eskimo pie that they finally just decided, forget trying to defend the Eskimo pie. Let's just sell candy.
Isn't that something? There are quite a few people in there who started creating one thing and they ended up in a completely different business. And that's what's interesting about the origins of these products. The book's called The Name Familiar. Our guest is Laura Lee. The Name's Familiar is the name of the book. Laura Lee is the guest. And John, you're up first for our trivia. We're going to ask some questions about names. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Okay, here's your question. True or false? Joseph Campbell never tasted the Campbell soup that his company became famous for.
I'll say true.
Yeah, that is true, isn't it, Laura?
Yes, he was never, it was a canning company, and they canned all kinds of things, vegetables and so on. And he retired in 1894 and left the company to some other people who came up with the idea of condensing soup. So it came out after Campbell was already gone, and he never tried it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. Now, you stay tuned to WHO Radio, and let's go to Geneva. Good morning, Geneva.
Yes.
Welcome to WHO Radio.
Thank you.
Which of the following was named for the owner's daughter? Was it Elizabeth Arden, Betty Crocker, or Sara Lee?
Oh, my. This will be strictly a guess.
Named for the owner's daughter, Elizabeth Arden, Betty Crocker, or Sara Lee?
Let's go with Sara Lee.
You got it.
Well, good.
Good job. Tell us that story, Laura.
Well, Sara Lee, her last name was actually Lubin. She was the daughter of Charles Lubin, who had a bakery. And he would bring home his baked goods and have his family try them out. And the cheesecake was a favorite of his daughter. So he started calling it by her name, Sara Lee Cheesecake. And it became the most popular thing in his whole bakery. So he named the bakery Sara Lee.
Good job, Geneva.
Thank you.
Alan, you're up next on Winzenburg on the Weekend. Hi, Alan.
Hi.
Here's your question. The leotard was named after what? Was the leotard named after Leonard Tarbach, Jules Leotard, or combining the words lion and leopard? Was it Leonard Tarbach, Jules Leotard, or combining the words lion and leopard?
I'll combine the words lion and leopard.
I thought I did a good job making that one up, didn't I, Laura?
I blew it, huh?
You blew it, Alan. What's the answer, Laura?
Well, it was actually a man named Leotard, Jules Leotard.
Jules Leotard created the leotard.
I'll be darned.
Isn't that amazing? Tell us, Laura, about it.
Well, the song "The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze," that song was written about Jules Leotard. He was a trapeze artist, and he wore this tight-fitting garment when he performed. And people started calling it a leotard because he made it so famous. He also thought that it never became quite as famous as he hoped because he thought that men should wear leotards every day as their everyday garment.
Really? Why? Did he think it would keep him warm or what?
I think he thought that it was an attractive garment.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
So the leotard was created for men by the gentleman who is the daring young man on the flying trapeze, Jules Leotard. See, the things you learn on WHO Radio. And let's go to Nancy next. Good morning, Nancy.
Hello.
Nancy, have you ever heard the word lush, like a lush is a person who drinks a lot of alcohol?
Sure have.
Okay, well, true or false? The term lush was named after a chaplain who had a bar named after him.
Oh, as wild as it seems, I guess I'll say true.
I think I would agree with that. Is that true, Laura?
Yes, he was a chaplain. He was also a heavy drinker, and he was so well known he was better known for his heavy drinking than for his preaching. So 200 years after he died, they named a pub after him in London. His name was Thomas Lushington, and the pub was the Lushington Pub. And people who came sort of slogging their way out of there, people started calling them lushes.
So an alcoholic's called a lush, and it's named after Lushington, the chaplain. Thanks, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Kenny, you're up next on WHO. Hi, Kenny.
Hi, how are you?
Great. Which of the following gave his name to a fish? Which of the following people gave his name to a fish? Was it David Salmon, R.J. Guppy, or James Flounder? Now, this is a real person who gave his name to a fish. Was it Salmon, Guppy, or Flounder?
I'm going to say Flounder.
No, it's a good guess, though. Laura Lee,
It's a Guppy.
Yeah, it is Guppy.
I was thinking I sure want my first.
Yeah, Laura, tell them about it.
Well, he was the president of the Scientific Association of Trinidad, and so part of his duties was to catalog different animals that he found in Trinidad, Venezuela, and he found this small fish, and the British Museum named it after him. Its scientific name is Gerandus guppy. A salmon, actually, Daniel Salmon was the veterinarian whose salmonella poisoning was named for.
Yeah, Daniel Salmon is the person who salmonella is named after. So the things you learn. Thanks, Kenny.
Okay, thank you.
Talking with Laura Lee, the author of The Names Familiar on News Radio 1040 WHO. And Linda's up next. Hi, Linda.
Good morning.
Well, here's a fun true-false question.
Okay.
I mentioned this to Steve Locker earlier. Taco Bell is named after a hot dog stand owner named Glenn Bell. Is that true or false? A hot dog stand owner named Glenn Bell.
I don't know. So I'll just say true.
It is true. He was the Bell, and Taco Bell was a person's name, and he started out selling hot dogs, and eventually he wanted to open a stand selling something that a lot of other people weren't selling, so he started selling tacos, and his restaurants were first called Taco Tia, but he later named them after himself.
Good guess, Linda.
Thank you.
So now when you go past Taco Bell, you can think of this hot dog stand owner. I think you say in the book, too, Laura, that he was a competitor with the original McDonald's, right? And he kind of couldn't stay in business with hot dogs, so he had to switch?
Yeah, the McDonald's were doing really well with hamburgers, and he was selling hamburgers and hot dogs, so he thought, well, I can't compete with them. I've got to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Sue, you're up next on WHO Radio. Hi, Sue.
Hi.
What did William Frisbee's company make? What did William Frisbee's company make? Was it toys, weapons, or pies?
Pies, I
Yeah,
believe.
good job, Sue. Of course it's pies, because that's what turned into the little Frisbee. They used the pie plate, right?
Right.
Is that right, Laura?
Yes, the students at Yale University, they'd buy the pies, and then they would throw the tins around. And
Trust Yale to do that.
Yeah, Yale did that. Wow. They're really working hard there at Yale.
Yes. I'm from I was born in New Haven, Connecticut, so I'm familiar with them.
Yeah. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
And Laura, in the book, you mentioned that some of the products were named after doctors. For instance, Bengay. Bengay was a real person. That was his last name. It's just spelled differently.
Right. In fact, when I called the company to find out, I wasn't sure if there was a Bengay, and I thought I would check. And I called up the company, and they laughed at me for asking the question. They said, "No, I don't think so." I said, "Well, just go ahead and send me the information on the history of your company anyway." And it turned out there was a Dr. Bengay. It was just spelled Bengue. And like a lot of products, they changed the spelling so Americans could pronounce it right.
And that was his last name, Bengay.
Right.
And also, Salisbury steak is named after a doctor.
Yes.
Why?
Who thought that that sort of creamy, fatty type of food was quite good for you. He recommended diets of lots of beef, lots of eggs, lots of milk, and he thought that would cure hardening of the arteries, and quite the opposite of what they say today, but he actually believed that was the most healthy diet, and so he developed this Salisbury steak.
So it's a great book that goes beyond just products of actual things we'd find in the store to some of the everyday things that we use. Steve, you're up next on WHO Radio. Ready for our quiz, Steve?
Well, no, Steve, actually, I've got a question.
Well, great. Go ahead and ask it.
I'm trying to figure out the origin of Baskin-Robbins.
Baskin-Robbins were two different people, and they were brothers-in-law. And they went into business together selling ice cream. And they actually had more than the 31 flavors, but they thought that it sounded good.
Oh, okay.
And you have that in the book, right?
Yeah.
You have it under Irvin Robbins. He was the one, he worked at his father's dairy, and then the two guys ended up creating this ice cream business.
Well, maybe their names are Ben and Jerry or something like that.
Well, Steve,
but Ben and Jerry are in the book too, though.
Steve, why don't you let me give you a trivia question, okay?
Okay, go ahead.
Mount Rushmore, this is true or false? Do you ever wonder where the name Mount Rushmore came from? True or false? Mount Rushmore was named after the grandfather of the man who first sculpted the president's faces. Was it named after the grandfather? False. Are you skeptical, Steve?
I am skeptical because the guy that sculpted him, I can't say it because it was his Slavic name.
Right, it was John Gutzon de la Mothe Borglum, I think.
So Laura, where did the name Rushmore come from?
Rushmore came from a lawyer named Charles Rushmore, who was riding along the mountain range with a guide, and he asked the guide what the mountain range was called, and he didn't know, so he said, well, we'll just call it Rushmore.
Isn't that something? Thanks, Steve. Wally, you're up next on Winzenburg on the Weekend. Hi, Wally.
Hi.
Which of the following was not a real person? Chef Boyardee, Duncan Hines, or Ronald McDonald? Who is not a real person? Chef Boyardee, Duncan Hines, or Ronald McDonald?
Well, Duncan Hines was that guy that said whether how the food was good or
right,
not.
Food critic.
Yeah. And food critic. And Ronald McDonald is the clown's name, isn't it? For
yeah, but we're talking about real person. We're not talking about a pretend clown. Was there a real Ronald McDonald or a real Chef Boyardee?
I'll say there wasn't a real Ronald McDonald.
Yeah, you're right. There wasn't a real Ronald McDonald, but there was a real Chef Boyardee. Laura, tell us about that one.
Well, Chef Boyardee, he's actually the man who you see on the can there. That's the real Hector Boyardee. He spelled his name Boiardi, and they just decided to spell it as Boyardee so people could pronounce it right. But he was a real chef and worked in restaurants making Italian food and pasta, and he thought if he could package it in a way that people could buy it without coming to the restaurant, he could probably sell quite a bit of it, and that's what he did.
Neat. That's an interesting story. Thanks, Wally. Laura, you mentioned in the book some Iowa names. You talk quite a bit about Blair, a person named Blair, because there's so many cities named after Blair. He was a railroad guy, wasn't he?
Yeah, that was actually one of my favorites and one of the obscure ones in the book. I enjoyed his story. He was a chief promoter and builder of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, so he got to name the towns where the railroad went through and created all these little towns.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a good friend named Oaks Ames, who he named a town after. He named a town for his daughter Alta and his other daughter Aurelia. And then he started naming towns after himself. He named Blair, Iowa, Blairsburg, Iowa, Blair, Nebraska, and he even named a town after his dog Colo.
Yeah, sure, Colo, Iowa.
Yep.
Named after Blair's dog.
Yep.
And I'm sure they're proud of that now. Laura Lee is the author of The Names Familiar on News Radio 1040 WHO.